My husband laughed in my face when I walked into the courtroom alone. He leaned over and whispered that I could never afford a real lawyer. I stayed perfectly silent. The woman standing next to me was not just a public defender. When she turned to me and called me sister, all the color drained from his face. He knew right then that she had his full confession. My name is Sarah. I am 34 years old. For the past 7 years, I have been the invisible engine keeping my husband Richard's luxury real estate brokerage afloat here in the North Shore of Chicago. I gave up my own path to becoming a certified public accountant to be his unpaid bookkeeper, his office manager, and his emotional punching bag. Richard is 36, tall, charismatic, and exactly the kind of man who can sell a $5 million mansion with just a smile and a handshake. But behind the scenes, I was the one making sure the property taxes were paid, the escrow accounts were balanced, and the lights stayed on. I poured every ounce of my energy into building his dream. I wore cheap clothes so he could afford custom suits. I skipped vacations so we could reinvest in marketing. I thought I was building our secure future. I thought every late night spent staring at spreadsheets was an investment in our marriage. I was incredibly wrong. The nightmare began on a rainy Tuesday night in late October. Richard was supposedly out entertaining a prospective buyer at an expensive downtown steakhouse. I was sitting at the dining room table surrounded by stacks of bank statements and expense reports. I was running the end-of-quarter reconciliation for the brokerage. It is a tedious, exhausting job, but numbers have always made sense to me. Numbers do not lie. They do not hide. They balance or they do not. That night, they absolutely did not balance. I was staring at the master ledger on my monitor when a massive anomaly jumped off the screen and punched me in the gut. There was a single wire transfer for $400,000. It was categorized simply as contractor escrow. My hands hovered over the keyboard. A chill crept up my arms. We did not have any active property developments that required a $400,000 contractor escrow. Even our biggest luxury renovations maxed out at a fraction of that cost. Furthermore, I was the only person authorized to approve a transfer of that size, or so I thought. I dug into the transaction details. The money had been wired out of our primary operating account 3 days ago, right around the time I had been fighting off a severe migraine and staying in bed. Richard had initiated the transfer himself. He had bypassed my security protocols by calling the bank directly and using his status as the primary account owner. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe he secured a massive new commercial listing. Maybe he bought a distressed property at a foreclosure auction and simply forgot to tell me. I needed to trace the routing number to be sure. I ran the international SWIFT code through the banking database. The destination was not a local Chicago construction firm. It was a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Panic set in. Real suffocating panic. $400,000 was almost all of our liquid capital. It was the money we needed to pay our agents, keep our office lease, and survive the upcoming winter slow season. I needed answers immediately. Richard had left his personal iPad on the kitchen counter charging. He rarely left it unattended, always claiming he needed it for late-night client emails. I walked over to the kitchen island, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I could hear it in my ears. The screen lit up. He had changed his passcode last month, claiming it was a new corporate security policy. But I knew Richard. I knew his predictable habits. I typed in the date he closed his very first $1 million listing. The screen unlocked immediately. I opened his email first. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Then I opened his text messages. There was a contact pinned to the very top hidden under the name Custom Cabinetry. But the profile picture was not a cabinet maker. It was Brittany. Brittany is 24 years old. She is Richard's flashy new junior agent. She drives a leased Porsche, wears designer clothes she cannot possibly afford on her standard commission splits, and barely knows how to draft a basic purchase agreement. Richard always defended her presence at the office, saying she had great networking potential and brought youthful energy to the team. My hands shook so violently, I nearly dropped the tablet on the hardwood floor. I opened the message thread. The first thing I saw was a series of high-resolution photos. Richard and Brittany were standing on the balcony of a stunning sun-drenched penthouse. The ocean sparkled brightly behind them. I scrolled up. The messages were a horrific tapestry of absolute betrayal. Brittany had sent a message saying the offshore wire had cleared and the seller had accepted their cash offer on the Miami condo. Richard replied with a string of heart emojis. He wrote that he could not wait to escape the freezing Chicago winters and leave his boring life behind. He called her his beautiful future. I kept reading, swallowing down the bitter bile rising in my throat. Brittany asked him what he was going to do about me. She asked if I would notice the missing money when I did the quarterly books. Richard's response is burned into my brain forever. He wrote, "Do not worry about Sarah. She's just a gullible maid. She signs whatever I put in front of her. By the time she realizes the accounts are drained, we will be drinking margaritas on South Beach. She will be left with absolutely nothing." I stopped breathing. The room seemed to spin. A gullible maid. 7 years of working 80-hour weeks for absolutely no salary. 7 years of managing his stress, cooking his meals, organizing his schedules, and building his empire from the ground up, reduced to a gullible maid. He was buying a luxury love nest with our life savings for a girl 10 years younger than me. The physical reaction was immediate and violent. I ran to the kitchen sink and threw up. I splashed cold water on my face, gripping the marble countertop until my fingers ached. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash the iPad against the wall. I wanted to pack my bags, drive away, and never look back. But the analytical part of my brain, the trained accountant inside me, forced me to stop. I wiped my mouth and walked back to the computer. Something was still fundamentally wrong. The math still did not make sense. I knew exactly how much cash the brokerage held in reserve. Even if Richard drained every single operating account to zero, we did not have a liquid $400,000 just sitting there, ready to wire. Some of that money had to come from somewhere else. I logged into our personal banking portal. I checked our joint savings account. It was completely empty, but that only accounted for $80,000. Where did the remaining $320,000 come from? I clicked on the loan dashboard. The page loaded agonizingly slowly. A new account appeared on the screen. It was a home equity line of credit drawn against our marital home, the house we lived in, the house my parents had helped us put the down payment on when we first got married. Richard had pulled a massive equity loan. He had secretly mortgaged the roof over my head to buy a tropical condo for his young mistress. I pulled up the digitized loan documents. There at the bottom of the final page was my signature. It was a perfect forgery. He had meticulously copied my handwriting from our joint tax returns and submitted the paperwork electronically using my digital seal. I sat in the silent, dark house, staring at the forged signature. The gravity of his betrayal crashed down on me like a collapsing building. Richard had not just cheated on me. He had not just stolen our life savings. He had actively, maliciously saddled me with nearly $500,000 in fraudulent debt. He had chained me to a sinking ship while he bought a luxury life raft for himself and his new girlfriend. If the bank called in that loan, I would lose the house. I would be entirely homeless, bankrupt, and utterly destroyed. He knew exactly what he was doing. He planned to leave me entirely destitute. The tears finally stopped. The profound shock gave way to something else entirely. A cold, calculating rage settled deep in my bones. He thought I was just a gullible bookkeeper. He thought I was a submissive, desperate wife who would cry, sign the divorce papers, and accept my financial ruin quietly. He forgot that I was the one who built his entire financial system. I knew every password. I knew every account. I knew every single loophole in his entire business operation. I spent the next 4 hours working in absolute silence. I downloaded every single bank statement. I took clear screenshots of every text message and photo on his iPad. I forwarded all the forged loan documents, the wire transfer receipts, and the offshore routing numbers to a secure external hard drive that I hid inside the lining of my winter coat. I covered my tracks perfectly, leaving the iPad exactly where I found it at the exact same battery percentage. When I finally heard his key turn in the front door around 2 in the morning, I was already in bed pretending to be fast asleep. I listened to his heavy footsteps in the hallway. I smelled the faint trace of expensive perfume and alcohol on his clothes when he slipped under the covers next to me. I lay perfectly still in the dark, my eyes wide open, listening to him breathe. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully stolen my life and my future. But the war had just begun, and I was going to systematically burn his entire world to the ground. The morning sun crept through the kitchen blinds, casting long pale shadows across the hardwood floor. I had not slept a single minute. I sat at the granite island staring at the coffee maker as it dripped. My mind was unusually sharp. The adrenaline from the night before had settled into a heavy, cold clarity. I heard the shower running upstairs, then the familiar heavy thud of Richard's footsteps descending the staircase. He walked into the kitchen wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, adjusting his silk tie. He looked like the picture of a devoted, successful husband. He smiled that signature $1,000,000 smile and reached for a mug. He asked me what was wrong and why I looked so pale. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply looked at him and asked how the weather was going to be in Miami. He stopped. The smile froze on his face. He slowly placed the empty mug on the counter. He asked me what I was talking about, playing the confused, innocent man. I told him I knew about the $400,000 wire transfer. I told him I knew about the luxury condo in Florida. And then I looked him dead in the eye and told him I knew about the forged home equity line of credit he took out against the very house we were standing in. I waited for the panic. I expected him to grovel, to deny it, to beg for forgiveness, or blame it on a banking mistake. But what happened next was far more terrifying. Richard did not panic. He let out a short breath, and then he laughed. It was not a nervous chuckle. It was a full, genuine laugh that echoed in the quiet kitchen. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms, looking at me as if I were a child who had just figured out a simple magic trick. He said he was wondering how long it would take me to notice the missing funds. He actually complimented me, saying I was always a very thorough bookkeeper. The absolute lack of remorse was staggering. He dropped his facade completely. The charming, supportive partner vanished, revealing a cold, calculating stranger. I asked him how he could do this to us after 7 years of marriage and building everything together. He looked at me with pure condescension. He told me that we did not build anything together. He said he was the talent, the face, and the closer. He told me I was just the administrative help. He told me that while I was busy worrying about utility bills and office supplies, he was out making moves, networking with millionaires, and living the life he deserved. He said he needed a partner who matched his vibrant energy and ambition, not a human calculator who spent her weekends clipping coupons and reconciling bank accounts. He actually used the word boring to describe my devotion. The utter disrespect was paralyzing. This was the man who used to kiss my hands and tell me he could never survive without my organizational skills. Now he was treating me like a disposable stepping stone. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, but I refused to let my voice shake. I demanded that he reverse the wire transfer and fix the forged loan immediately. I told him that what he did was not just unethical, it was a federal crime. He laughed again, a sound so callous it made my blood run cold. He shook his head and coldly informed me that the money was already gone safely, sitting in a private offshore trust in the Caribbean that I could never legally touch. He boasted about how he had been planning this exit strategy for the past 8 months. He admitted he had deliberately delayed paying off our local vendors just to hoard enough cash for the transfer. He said he needed my pristine credit score to secure that final equity loan to fund his new life. He casually mentioned that he was not going to let my sentimental attachment to a dead marriage get in the way of his personal happiness and financial freedom. I reached for my purse, intending to grab my phone, and called the bank fraud department to freeze everything myself. Richard watched my movements with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. He told me not to even bother wasting my breath. He leaned across the granite island and cheerfully informed me that he had spent the early hours of the morning making a few strategic phone calls to our financial institutions. Because he was listed as the primary account holder on our joint profiles, he had already restricted my access to all of our operating accounts, our savings, and our business lines of credit. He said he had also reported every single credit card bearing my name as lost or stolen. He had completely financially paralyzed me before the sun even fully rose. Before I could process the reality of being entirely cut off from my own money, the heavy oak door of his home office swung open. I felt my stomach drop. Out walked Brittany. She was wearing a silk robe that I recognized instantly because it belonged to me. It was a gift from my mother for my 30th birthday. But that was not the worst part. She was holding a steaming cup of coffee in my favorite hand-painted ceramic mug. Around her neck sparkled a diamond pendant necklace that easily cost more than my first car. She did not look embarrassed or ashamed to be caught sleeping with her boss in my home. She looked triumphant, like a predator who had just claimed her territory. She walked straight over to Richard and wrapped her arm around his waist, resting her chin on his shoulder. She looked at me and offered a sickeningly sweet, condescending smile. She said it was really too bad I had to find out this way, but Richard deserved a vibrant woman who could keep up with his elite lifestyle. She actually had the nerve to thank me for keeping the corporate books so incredibly clean, because it made the international mortgage approval for their Miami penthouse an absolute breeze. The sheer audacity was suffocating. I stood there, looking at the 24-year-old woman who had helped destroy my life, flaunting stolen jewelry and casually wearing my clothes in my own kitchen. I found my voice and told her to get out of my house immediately. Richard stepped forward, physically shielding her from my gaze. He reached into his expensive leather briefcase resting on the counter and pulled out a thick, heavily stapled manila envelope. He tossed it onto the kitchen island. It slid across the polished granite and stopped right in front of me. He told me those were the official divorce papers. He said his high-priced attorney had drafted a highly expedited settlement agreement overnight. He laid out the terms with brutal corporate efficiency. I would be allowed to keep my leased sedan and receive a pathetic $10,000 one-time payout. In exchange, I would assume 100% responsibility for the $400,000 home equity line of credit because legally, my digital signature was on the final approval documents. I stared at the envelope, feeling a wave of absolute revulsion wash over me. He wanted to leave me hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent debt, while he walked away with our entire liquid fortune and his new mistress. I told him I would never sign that garbage. I told him I would take him to court and expose every single fraudulent transaction he had ever made. Richard leaned in close, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. He told me I was in no position to make threats. He reminded me that I had exactly $0 to my name as of this morning. He said if I did not sign those papers within 48 hours, he would drag the litigation out for years. He promised to bury me in legal fees I could not afford until I was completely bankrupt and sleeping on the streets. He said he would make sure no judge ever believed a bitter housewife over a respected local business owner. He told me I needed to leave the property immediately so he and Brittany could pack the rest of his belongings in peace. I refused to move. I told him this was my house and he was the one who needed to leave. Richard did not argue. He simply pulled his smartphone from his pocket. He opened the home security application. The entire house had been outfitted with a state-of-the-art smart system last year, a system he insisted we install for our safety. He tapped the screen a few times. I heard the electronic chimes echo through the house as the system reset. He looked at me with eyes so devoid of human empathy, they looked completely black. He said he was the primary administrator on the digital deed and the security network. He had just revoked my access codes and removed my biometric data from the system. He told me if I did not walk out the front door right now, he would call the police and report an aggressive trespasser. He said he would tell them his mentally unstable soon-to-be ex-wife was refusing to vacate the premises and causing a domestic disturbance. He held all the power and he knew it. I looked at Brittany, who was smirking from behind his shoulder. I looked at Richard, the man I had sacrificed my youth and my career to support. There was no reasoning with them. There was no arguing with a man who had meticulously planned my destruction. I picked up my purse and my car keys from the counter. I did not say another word. I turned my back on them and walked down the hallway toward the front door. Every step felt incredibly heavy, as if I were walking underwater. I opened the door and stepped out into the crisp autumn morning air. Before I could even reach the bottom of the porch steps, I heard the heavy front door slam shut behind me. Immediately after, a loud electronic beep echoed from the keypad lock. The deadbolt engaged automatically. I stood in the driveway looking back at the house I had lovingly decorated and maintained for 7 years. Through the large front bay window, I could clearly see Richard and Brittany walking back toward the kitchen, laughing together as if they had just taken out the trash. He had literally locked me out of my own life with nothing but the clothes on my back, my purse, and the keys to my car. I walked over to my sedan and got into the driver's seat. I locked the doors and gripped the steering wheel, staring blankly at the closed garage door. The reality of the situation crashed down on me in heavy, suffocating waves. My bank accounts were completely frozen. My credit cards were dead plastic. I was staring down nearly $500,000 in forged debt that had my name attached to it. My husband of 7 years had just discarded me like an obsolete piece of office equipment. I was supposed to break down right then and there. I was supposed to cry hysterically, scream, pound my fist on the heavy wooden front door, and beg him to let me back in. That is exactly what Richard expected me to do. He wanted me to be weak and emotionally unhinged so he could justify his false narrative to our friends and family of being the victim of a crazy, unstable wife. But sitting alone in that cold car, I felt the exact opposite of weakness. The initial shock and heartbreak had entirely burned away, leaving behind a fierce, burning clarity that sharpened my senses. I realized that Richard had made one catastrophic miscalculation in his grand exit strategy. He arrogantly believed that taking my money and locking me out of my house would permanently strip me of my power. He fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. I was not just a subservient housewife. I was the meticulous architect of his entire financial existence. I knew exactly where every single skeleton was buried in his real estate brokerage. I knew the specific tax loopholes he illegally exploited. I knew the client escrow accounts he improperly leveraged to cover his personal expenses. Most importantly, I had all of that damning data secured on the encrypted hard drive currently sitting safely in my coat pocket. He thought I was broke and powerless. He thought I had absolutely no one to turn to and nowhere to go. He gave me a 48-hour ultimatum to sign my life away, thinking I would crumble under the pressure. He wanted a grueling war of attrition. He wanted to starve me out financially until I surrendered unconditionally to his predatory terms. But he completely forgot that a woman who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous opponent in the world. I put the car in drive and backed out of the driveway without a single tear falling from my eyes. I did not look back at the house. I was heading to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town to gather my thoughts and prepare for the massive legal battle ahead. I was going to use every single piece of financial ammunition I had meticulously gathered to completely dismantle the arrogant man who thought he could simply throw me away. The morning confrontation was over, but the real destruction was just getting started. The harsh hum of the fluorescent light outside my window was the only sound keeping me company in the desolate motel room. The stale odor of old cigarettes and cheap bleach hung heavily in the air, clinging to the thin polyester blanket draped over my shoulders. I sat on the edge of a remarkably uncomfortable mattress, holding a paper cup of lukewarm bitter coffee. Just 48 hours ago, I was managing a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio from a custom-designed home office in the North Shore. Now my entire existence was reduced to a scuffed suitcase, a dead cell phone charger, and the encrypted hard drive buried deep inside the lining of my winter coat. The profound whiplash of my new reality was physically exhausting. My muscles ached from the tension, and my eyes burned from a severe lack of sleep. But I could not afford the luxury of a breakdown. The $400,000 forged home equity loan was a massive weight pressing down on my chest. Richard had given me 48 hours to sign his predatory divorce settlement or face total financial ruin. I knew the clock was ticking relentlessly. I needed legal representation, and I needed a bulldog who could tear his fraudulent claims to shreds. I opened my laptop and connected to the unsecured, flickering motel internet. I navigated to a search engine and began compiling a list of the most aggressive high-net-worth family law attorneys in Cook County. I did not want a mediator. I did not want a collaborative divorce specialist. I wanted a seasoned litigator who knew how to dismantle hidden assets and expose white-collar fraud. I cross-referenced reviews, checked State Bar Association records, and narrowed my list down to the 12 most formidable law firms in the greater Chicago area. These were the names whispered in fear at country club galas. These were the attorneys who handled complex corporate divorces. I felt a surge of confident momentum. I had undeniable proof of wire fraud, offshore embezzlement, and a forged digital signature. Any competent lawyer would recognize the magnitude of this evidence and take my case on contingency. I pulled up my phone and dialed the first number on my top tier list. A receptionist with a crisp, highly polished voice answered the line. I provided my name and calmly stated that I was seeking immediate representation for a complex high-asset divorce involving extensive financial fraud and forged property documents. She sounded immediately attentive and placed me on a brief hold to run a standard intake check against their client database. When the hold music stopped, her tone had completely shifted. The warmth was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, rigid professionalism. She informed me that she was terribly sorry, but their firm could not schedule a consultation with me because it would represent a direct conflict of interest. I frowned, brushing it off as a strange coincidence. Perhaps Richard had crossed paths with one of their partners at a real estate networking event. I thanked her, hung up, and confidently dialed the second firm on my meticulously researched list. Another polite greeting followed by another request to hold. 3 minutes later, a different receptionist delivered the exact same scripted rejection. She claimed a conflict of interest prevented any attorney in their building from hearing the details of my case. A knot of cold dread began to form in the pit of my stomach. I quickly dialed the third firm, then the fourth, and the fifth. The pattern repeated itself with terrifying precision. Every single elite family law practice in the county gave me the exact same Stonewall response: conflict of interest. The words echoed in my head with each subsequent phone call. By the time I reached the ninth firm on my list, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely type the digits into my phone. I begged the receptionist to explain how this was even possible. I demanded to know how every major legal practice in the city could be conflicted out of a case that had not even been filed yet. The young woman on the other end of the line hesitated. She heard the raw, mounting desperation in my voice and took a moment of professional pity on me. She lowered her voice to a soft whisper and explained the brutal reality of the legal trap my husband had sprung. She revealed that over the past 2 months, Richard had systematically scheduled brief initial consultations with every prominent divorce litigator within a 50-mile radius. He never actually retained their services. He simply sat in their plush leather chairs, shared a few confidential details about our marriage, our assets, and his potential divorce strategy, and cheerfully paid their hourly consultation fee. By executing this seemingly innocent maneuver, he had successfully created a legally binding attorney-client privilege with every single one of those top-tier lawyers. Under strict state ethics laws, none of those attorneys or anyone in their respective firms could ever legally represent the opposing party. He had essentially bought the silence and the neutrality of the entire local legal establishment. He had blacklisted me from securing any competent local counsel without ever having to hire them to fight me. The absolute sheer malice of his premeditated strategy was breathtaking. He had not just planned to drain our joint accounts and replace me with a younger model. He had meticulously orchestrated my complete and utter inability to fight back. He had weaponized the very legal system that was supposed to offer me protection. I closed my laptop and stared blankly at the stained wall of the motel room. The feeling of total isolation was suffocating. He had neutralized the battlefield long before I even realized we were at war. The heavy silence of the room was violently interrupted by the sharp chime of my cell phone. It was a text message notification from Richard. I stared at his name glowing on the cracked screen, feeling a wave of intense nausea. My thumb hovered over the glass before I finally tapped the notification open. It was a high-resolution photograph. Richard and Brittany were sitting intimately at a secluded corner booth inside one of the most exclusive and impossibly expensive Michelin-starred restaurants in downtown Chicago. A bottle of incredibly rare vintage champagne rested in a silver chilling bucket beside their table. Brittany was wearing a brand new designer silk dress, leaning heavily into Richard's shoulder with a smug, victorious smile plastered across her heavily made-up face. Richard was holding up his crystal champagne flute toward the camera, looking directly into the lens with an expression of supreme, untouchable arrogance. Directly beneath the photograph was a short typed message. It read, "Sign the papers, Sarah. You literally cannot afford a lawyer to fight me." The sheer audacity of the message sent a surge of boiling heat straight through my veins. He was sitting there, drinking $1,000 champagne purchased with my stolen life savings, dining at the exact restaurant I had booked for our anniversary just last year, and openly mocking my engineered helplessness. He knew exactly what he had accomplished with his fraudulent consultation strategy. He was actively monitoring the situation, waiting for the exact moment I realized that I was completely securely boxed in. He expected me to reply with frantic tears. He expected me to call him and beg for a tiny scrap of mercy. He was eagerly anticipating the notification that I had finally caved to his predatory demands and agreed to absorb his massive fraudulent debt just to make the terrifying nightmare stop. I stared hard at the photograph, analyzing the arrogant smirk twisting his features and the flashy diamond pendant resting heavily against Brittany's collarbone. They looked so incredibly invincible in their stolen luxury bubble. They truly believed they had successfully committed the perfect financial crime. I tossed the phone onto the sagging bedspread. The overwhelming despair that had been threatening to swallow me whole just moments ago suddenly vanished. It was entirely incinerated by a cold, relentless clarity. Richard was absolutely right about one fundamental thing. I could not possibly fight him using local tools. He had bought the local board, he had rigged the local rules, and he had effectively shut me out of the entire Chicago legal network. If I played by his carefully constructed game, I would lose absolutely everything. I realized in that suffocating little motel room that I had to bring a weapon he could never possibly anticipate. I needed someone who operated entirely outside of his corrupted sphere of influence. I needed a legal force that functioned on a completely different level of corporate ruthlessness. I stood up and unzipped my scuffed suitcase, digging past my neatly folded sweaters and reaching into the very bottom fabric lining. My fingers brushed against the familiar texture of a small worn leather address book. It was an old physical relic from before the days of cloud storage and smartphones, a personal directory of contacts I had maintained since my early college days. I pulled it out and flipped through the yellowed paper pages. I stopped abruptly at the letter S. There, written in faded blue ink, was a New York area code. It was a 10-digit number I had not dialed in over 6 long years. It belonged to Victoria. Victoria is my older half-sister. We shared the same father, but we grew up navigating entirely different worlds. While I had chosen the quiet, predictable path of Midwestern corporate accounting, Victoria had fully embraced the brutal, high-stakes arena of corporate litigation in Manhattan. She was a senior managing partner at a massive law firm that routinely struck fear into the hearts of Wall Street executives. We had experienced a bitter, deeply painful falling out years ago over the complicated handling of our late father's estate. Harsh, unforgiving words were exchanged in the heat of grief regarding her clinical approach to his assets. My soft-hearted nature had clashed terribly with her cold, relentless pragmatism. The stubborn pride running thick through our family veins had kept us completely silent ever since. Richard knew all about the estrangement. He used to openly mock Victoria behind her back, calling her a heartless corporate shark who cared more about her exorbitant billable hours than her own flesh and blood. He felt incredibly secure in his theft, knowing I was completely isolated from her formidable influence. He assumed my pride would prevent me from ever reaching out to the one person who could actually destroy him. I stared at the numbers written on the page, feeling the heavy weight of history pressing against my chest. The foolish pride that had kept me from calling her for 6 long years felt remarkably trivial compared to the total financial and emotional annihilation Richard had planned for me. Blood history is often messy and complicated, but absolute betrayal demands an absolute and devastating response. I suddenly understood that the very ruthlessness I used to resent in Victoria was exactly what I needed to survive. I picked up my cell phone, pulled up the dialing keypad, and firmly punched in the New York number. I pressed the green call button and lifted the receiver to my ear. The phone rang once. It rang twice. The hollow electronic sound of the connecting tone felt exactly like the steady drumbeat of an impending war. On the 3rd ring, the line clicked open. A sharp, highly authoritative female voice answered the call, asking for the identity of the caller. I took a deep, steadying breath, gripping the plastic casing of the phone so tightly my knuckles turned a stark white. I cleared my throat and spoke with absolute resolve. I told her, "Hello, Victoria, it is Sarah, and I need a shark." The line was completely silent for what felt like an absolute eternity. I sat on the edge of the sagging motel mattress, gripping my cellular phone tightly against my ear. 6 long years of stubborn silence stretched between us. The very last time Victoria and I had spoken, we were standing outside a probate attorney office in downtown Chicago, shouting awful, unforgivable things at each other. She had viewed our late father's estate as a simple mathematical equation needing to be liquidated and divided. I had been drowning in fresh grief, clinging desperately to every sentimental item in his home. I had called her a heartless machine. She had called me a naive, foolish child who let emotion cloud reality. We walked away in opposite directions and never looked back. Now here I was, swallowing every ounce of my pride, ready to admit that she had been entirely right about my judgment. Victoria finally broke the silence. Her voice was sharp, crisp, and undeniably powerful. She did not offer a warm greeting or ask how I had been. She immediately demanded to know exactly why I was calling her at this hour in such a frantic state. I did not waste time with pleasantries or tearful apologies. I laid out the brutal, naked facts. I told her my husband Richard had systematically drained our joint accounts. I explained how he wired $400,000 to a private offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands to buy a luxury beachfront condominium for his 24-year-old junior real estate agent. I told her he had locked me out of our home and frozen all my credit cards. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I explained that Richard had forged my signature on a massive home equity line of credit, leaving me holding $500,000 in fraudulent debt, while he effectively blacklisted me from every top-tier family law attorney in Cook County. The silence on the other end of the line shifted dramatically. It was no longer the silence of a distant, estranged sibling. It was the dangerous electric quiet of an apex predator sensing fresh blood in the water. Victoria did not offer me empty platitudes or useless sympathy. She did not ask how my broken heart was handling the ultimate betrayal. She simply asked me for the exact address of my cheap motel. She told me to stay exactly where I was, lock the door, and not answer a single text message from Richard. She said she was booking the next available red-eye flight out of LaGuardia Airport and would be sitting in my room before midnight. The sheer overwhelming relief that washed over me was physically staggering. I fell back onto the cheap, lumpy pillows, and for the very first time since my world collapsed, I finally took a full, deep breath. The torrential rain was lashing aggressively against the thin glass of my motel window when a sleek black executive town car pulled into the poorly lit parking lot. I watched through the broken plastic blinds as Victoria stepped out into the raging storm. She was 42 years old and looked absolutely formidable. She wore a perfectly tailored dark charcoal blazer over a crisp white silk blouse, completely untouched by the stressful travel or the miserable Midwestern weather. She carried an oversized structured leather briefcase that looked significantly more like a weapon than a simple accessory. When I opened the heavy wooden door, she stepped inside and slowly surveyed the depressing room. The peeling yellow wallpaper and stained carpet were a massive departure from her pristine Manhattan penthouse. She looked at me standing there in my wrinkled clothes with dark circles carved under my eyes. The hard professional lines of her face softened just for a tiny fraction of a second. She dropped her heavy briefcase on the small laminate desk and wrapped her arms around me. It was a firm, fiercely protective embrace. We did not share the same mother, and we had chosen wildly different paths in life, but the powerful bond of our shared blood was suddenly undeniable. The silly, immature feud over our inheritance evaporated entirely in the face of this immediate, profound threat. She stepped back, looked me squarely in the eyes, and firmly stated that we were going to utterly destroy the arrogant man who did this to me. I walked over to my coat and retrieved the encrypted hard drive I had meticulously smuggled out of Richard's home office. Victoria plugged the small device into her high-powered legal laptop. For the next 3 consecutive hours, the miserable motel room transformed into a highly tactical legal command center. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers fly across the glowing keyboard as she rapidly pulled up the digital documents I had salvaged. She intensely reviewed the banking ledgers, the offshore wire transfer receipts, and the extensive cache of nauseating text messages between Richard and his young, flashy mistress, Brittany. When she finally opened the digitized loan documents for the home equity line of credit, she leaned much closer to the bright screen. She intensely examined the forged signature Richard had submitted. Victoria is a ruthless corporate litigator who spends her days dismantling massive multi-billion-dollar conglomerates. She eats arrogant, deceitful executives for breakfast. I could actually see the shark instincts fully taking over her posture as she analyzed the paperwork. She pointed a sharp finger at the screen and explained the true magnitude of Richard's fatal, catastrophic mistake. She told me that Richard thought he was playing a simple local game of marital asset hiding. He arrogantly believed this was just a standard messy divorce where a bullying wealthy husband starves out his financially dependent wife. He fundamentally misunderstood the immense gravity of his specific actions. Victoria explained that by electronically submitting a forged signature to a federally insured banking institution across state lines to secure a massive loan, he had crossed completely over from a simple domestic dispute into the realm of serious federal crimes. He had committed intentional wire fraud, severe bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Victoria began pacing the small, narrow span of the motel room and laughed a cold, deeply dark laugh. She told me Richard had basically handed us the shiny keys to his very own federal prison cell. But she quickly warned me that we could not simply march into the local police precinct and hand over the computer drive. Richard was a smooth-talking, highly charismatic real estate broker with deep established ties to the local community. He had already manipulated the local legal system by executing his fake consultations and conflicting out every good attorney in town. If we tipped our hand too early, he might use his vast local connections to claim a simple clerical misunderstanding or try to pin the entire forgery scheme on his naive young mistress. We needed to be infinitely smarter than he was. We needed to let him enthusiastically build his own gallows. Victoria sat down opposite me at the small table and carefully laid out a brilliant, devastating legal strategy. She told me that her entire Manhattan law firm operated entirely far beyond the reach of Richard's petty local blacklist. She was going to personally represent me as my lead counsel, but we were going to keep her involvement an absolute closely guarded secret until the perfect dramatic moment. She instructed me to play the exact pathetic role Richard expected me to play. I needed to be the completely broken, defeated, and financially desperate housewife. Richard thrived exclusively on his own raging narcissism and his overwhelming sense of superiority. He firmly believed I was completely isolated, drowning in panic, and entirely incapable of fighting back. Victoria said we were going to feed that massive, fragile ego until it completely burst. She told me to begin replying to his arrogant, taunting text messages with short, highly fearful responses. I was to beg him for more time to review the grossly unfair settlement agreement he had presented. When the mandatory divorce mediation session approached, I had to show up looking completely exhausted, disorganized, and entirely alone. I had to let him gloat in my face. I had to let his sleazy, aggressive local attorney talk down to me as if I were stupid. The entire goal was to make Richard feel so incredibly safe and wonderfully untouchable that he would inevitably drop his guard. Victoria explained perfectly that arrogant men who truly think they have won always make incredibly stupid, fatal mistakes when they are trying to show off their power. She desperately wanted Richard to go on the official mediation record, acting like a complete tyrant. She needed him to formally document his ridiculous financial claims and blatant lies. By acting totally submissive and helpless, I would successfully encourage him to openly admit to hiding the liquid assets in front of a sworn legal mediator, because he truly believed I lacked the financial resources to do anything about it. Meanwhile, Victoria and her dedicated team of elite forensic accountants back in New York would quietly rip into Richard's luxury real estate brokerage. They would expertly tear apart his corporate tax filings, trace the hidden offshore shell companies, and completely solidify the federal fraud case without him ever suspecting a single thing. She promised me, looking deep into my tired eyes, that by the time we finally stepped into a real courtroom, Richard would not just be fighting a simple divorce settlement. He would be fighting for his actual freedom. I sat quietly and listened to my older sister outline the meticulous ultimate destruction of my husband. The suffocating terror that had tightly gripped my throat for the past 2 days completely vanished. The fear was entirely replaced by a cold, solid foundation of pure determination. I looked at the heavy rain washing down the dark window pane and felt a profound, remarkable sense of empowerment. I was absolutely ready to play my assigned part. I was ready to be the gullible, naive maid he thought I was, just long enough to happily watch his entire glittering empire crumble into dust. Victoria closed her laptop with a sharp, definitive snap. She reached across the table and took my hands in hers. She told me to get some real sleep because tomorrow the real performance would begin. We were going to make him pay for every single tear and every stolen dollar. The lonely, desperate housewife in the cheap motel was gone. She had been replaced by a woman backed by the most ruthless legal mind on the eastern seaboard, and Richard had absolutely no idea what was coming for him. The fluorescent lights in the Cook County Mandatory Mediation Center buzzed with a relentless grating hum that seemed to vibrate straight through my skull. The room smelled of cheap floor wax and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the luxurious mahogany and leather environments Richard was accustomed to. I sat alone, being on one side of a chipped laminate conference table, staring down at my tightly folded hands. I had spent the entire morning meticulously preparing my appearance for this exact moment. Victoria, my brilliant and ruthless sister, had given me very specific instructions before she flew back to New York to finalize her legal trap. She told me to look exactly like the defeated, broken woman my husband expected to see. I wore a faded, oversized grey cardigan that I had deliberately pulled from the very bottom of a donation bin. My hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot, and I wore absolutely no makeup except for a faint dusting of ash-brown powder beneath my lower lashes to accentuate the dark circles of my sleepless nights. I looked thoroughly exhausted, financially ruined, and entirely devoid of hope. I looked like a woman who had been completely crushed by the weight of her own miserable reality. The heavy wooden door of the conference room swung open with an aggressive thud. Richard walked in, and the oppressive atmosphere of the room instantly shifted to accommodate his massive ego. He wore a breathtaking, custom-tailored charcoal suit that I recognized immediately. I knew exactly how much it cost because I was the one who had balanced the corporate account he secretly used to purchase it. He smelled of expensive sandalwood cologne and absolute victory. He was not alone. Flanking him on his right was his attorney, a notoriously aggressive local bulldog named Bradley. Bradley was a man known around the Chicago legal circuit for his sleazy intimidation tactics and his complete lack of moral boundaries. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and wore a smug, predatory smile. On Richard's left, completely uninvited and entirely out of place, was Brittany. Brittany treated the solemn legal proceeding as if she were stepping into a VIP lounge at a downtown nightclub. She wore a pristine white designer dress that clung tightly to her youthful frame, and strapped around her ankle were high heels that likely cost more than my first car. But it was the jewelry that caught my eye. Resting heavily against her collarbone was a thick diamond tennis necklace, sparkling under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was purchased with the very same money Richard had siphoned out of our joint savings. She took the seat directly next to my husband, crossing her legs, and looking at me with a sickening mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. She sipped a heavily iced coffee, carrying an air of supreme, untouchable entitlement. The court-appointed mediator, a weary-looking older gentleman, adjusted his glasses and pressed the flashing red record button on the digital audio device sitting in the exact center of the table. He formally announced the date, the time, and the names of the parties present for the official legal transcript. He then reminded everyone in the room that this session was legally binding and that the audio recording would be submitted to the family court judge as part of the official divorce docket. I kept my head bowed, letting my shoulders visibly slump. I forced my hands to tremble slightly as they rested on the table. Inside my chest, my heart was beating with a slow, rhythmic, icy precision. Every panicked breath I took, every nervous twitch of my fingers was a calculated performance designed to feed the raging monster of my husband's narcissism. Bradley did not waste a single second. He aggressively unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily stapled document, sliding it roughly across the laminate table toward me. It stopped right in front of my folded hands. Bradley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and spoke to me in a tone usually reserved for reprimanding a stubborn child. He stated that his client was being incredibly generous given the circumstances. He claimed that Richard wanted to execute a swift and amicable dissolution of the marriage to save me from the embarrassing public spectacle of a protracted legal battle. Bradley tapped his expensive gold pen against the document and began outlining the predatory settlement terms with a sickeningly cheerful cadence. The terms were nothing short of financial slaughter. Richard was offering me a one-time lump sum payment of exactly $10,000. I would be allowed to keep the lease on my 4-year-old Honda sedan, assuming I took over the monthly payments myself. I would immediately forfeit any and all claims to his luxury real estate brokerage, including the highly lucrative client list that I had personally managed and organized for the past 7 years. But the final term was the absolute kill shot. According to the printed document, I would assume 100% of the financial liability for the $400,000 home equity line of credit, because legally, my digital signature was on the approval forms. I stared at the thick stack of paper. Richard was attempting to legally bind me to $500,000 of fraudulent debt, while he walked away completely clean with our entire liquid fortune safely hidden in the Cayman Islands. He wanted the official court record to show that I willingly and voluntarily accepted my own total financial annihilation. I looked up from the document and let a perfectly timed tear slip down my cheek. I looked directly at Richard, letting my voice crack and waver. I begged him to reconsider. I pleaded with him, telling him that he knew I did not have a job outside of his brokerage and that $10,000 would barely cover my rent at the cheap motel for a few months. I told him the massive bank debt would instantly force me into bankruptcy and ruin my life forever. Richard leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his tailored stomach. He looked at me with an expression of supreme, chilling indifference. He did not see a woman he had loved for 7 years. He saw an annoying obstacle that he was about to permanently eradicate. He completely ignored the mediator's gentle reminder to keep the conversation productive and respectful. Richard wanted to crush my spirit entirely, and he wanted Brittany to sit there and witness his ultimate triumph. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, directly mirroring his sleazy attorney. He looked at me and delivered a monologue of such profound, staggering arrogance that I practically felt Victoria's corporate shark instincts cheering inside my head. Richard told me that I needed to stop playing the victim. He stated proudly for the digital audio recorder, picking up every single syllable, that he was the sole reason we ever had any money in the first place. He said my fundamental lack of ambition was exactly why he had outgrown our marriage. Then, driven entirely by his desperate need to show off his power in front of his new young mistress, he made the fatal, catastrophic error Victoria had explicitly predicted. He lowered his voice slightly, but ensured it was loud enough for the microphone to capture. He told me that even if I refused to sign the paperwork and tried to drag him into a messy public courtroom, I would absolutely lose. He boasted that I had no idea how the real world of high finance actually worked. He proudly declared that he had spent the last year carefully positioning his assets. He explicitly stated that he held undisclosed liquid reserves heavily insulated far beyond the reach of any local Chicago judge. He bragged that he had international mobility and financial security that a basic bookkeeper like me could never even begin to comprehend. He told me I could spend the next decade drowning in legal fees fighting him, but I would never touch a single dime of his real wealth because I simply did not have the resources to find it. The mediator shifted uncomfortably in his chair, completely shocked by the blatant admission of hidden assets during a recorded legal proceeding. He cleared his throat and formally reminded Richard that all marital funds were subject to full legal disclosure under penalty of perjury. Bradley, the attorney, quickly shot his client a sharp warning glance, attempting to interrupt the arrogant tirade. But Richard waved his lawyer off, completely drunk on his own perceived invincibility. Richard laughed and told the mediator that everything was perfectly legal and filed under proper corporate entities. He firmly believed his offshore shell companies were completely bulletproof. He thought because I was sitting there in a thrift store sweater, crying and shaking, I was entirely incapable of understanding the massive legal confession he had just handed me on a silver platter. I kept my head down, hiding the fierce, triumphant fire burning behind my eyes. Victoria had told me that arrogant men always trip over their own egos. Richard had just explicitly admitted on a sworn court transcript to intentionally hiding marital assets, holding undisclosed liquid reserves, and utilizing international banking to evade domestic legal jurisdiction. He had just handed us the absolute smoking gun we needed to elevate this from a simple civil divorce dispute into a massive federal fraud investigation. Now I just needed to set the final hook. I needed to ensure he walked out of this room believing he had completely won, so he would not panic and attempt to move the offshore funds again before Victoria could legally freeze them. I began to softly sob. burying my face in my hands. I let my shoulders shake violently, putting on the performance of a lifetime. Through my faked tears, I looked at the sleazy attorney and told him the legal language in the document was too confusing for me to understand. I said I was terrified of signing something that would send me to prison for a debt I could not pay. I looked back at Richard, my eyes wide and perfectly desperate. I begged him for just a little more time. I told him I was completely broke and currently living out of a suitcase in a motel room that smelled like bleach. I promised him I was not trying to fight him for the brokerage or his new life with Brittany. I simply pleaded for one more week to review the paperwork. I told him I needed just 7 days to see if I could find a free public defender or a pro bono legal aid clinic to look over the contract, so I could safely sign it without losing my mind. The words public defender hung in the air of the sterile conference room. Bradley, the bulldog attorney, let out a loud, unprofessional snort of laughter. Brittany actually giggled, covering her mouth with her manicured hand, her diamond necklace catching the light. Richard stared at me, taking in my messy hair, my cheap clothes, and my trembling hands. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. He saw a thoroughly destroyed, broken woman desperately grasping at straws. Richard smiled a slow, cruel, deeply satisfied smile. He turned to the mediator and officially stated for the record that he was a reasonable and generous man. He magnanimously declared that he would grant his estranged wife exactly 1 more week to seek out her free public defender. He leaned across the table, looking me right in the eyes, and whispered that a cheap legal aid lawyer was not going to save me from the mountain of debt I owed. He told me to enjoy my extra 7 days in the motel because after that, he was coming for everything. The mediator officially concluded the session and stopped the recording. Richard stood up, buttoning his custom suit jacket, offering his arm to a beaming Brittany. They walked out of the conference room together, completely confident that they had orchestrated the perfect crime. I remained seated in my cheap plastic chair, listening to their footsteps echo down the hallway. I slowly wiped away the fake tears, resting my hands flat against the table. I had my extra week. Richard had his massive inflated ego. He had absolutely no idea that the public defender I was bringing to court next week was going to financially slaughter him. The moment the heavy wooden doors of the mediation center finally closed behind my arrogant husband, my entire physical posture completely transformed. The hunched shoulders and trembling hands I had so carefully maintained for the past hour vanished instantly. I stood up from the chipped laminate table and took a long, steadying breath. I walked directly out of the suffocating local courthouse and headed straight toward the designated meeting spot. I climbed into the back of a discreet black town car where my sister Victoria was already coordinating her strike team from the leather back seat. We immediately sped away from the downtown area and headed straight to a highly secure temporary office space Victoria had leased in the financial district of Chicago. She absolutely refused to operate out of my depressing cheap motel room any longer. We needed secure data servers, high-speed internet connections, and absolute total privacy for what was about to happen next. Back in New York, Victoria's elite squad of corporate forensic accountants had been completely unleashed. I had provided them with the master administrative passwords, the encrypted hard drive I smuggled out of the house, and the backdoor access codes to Richard's entire luxury real estate brokerage. What her team found hidden beneath the highly polished surface of his flashy brand was not just simple marital theft. It was a sprawling, deeply disturbing criminal enterprise that completely took my breath away. Sitting right beside Victoria, staring at the massive wall monitors, displaying endless rows of digital banking ledgers, I watched my husband's pristine professional reputation disintegrate in real time. The financial team expertly, methodically traced the origin of the massive $400,000 wire transfer that had purchased the Miami condominium for Brittany. Richard had been incredibly sloppy and arrogant in his execution. He wrongly assumed that because he had locked me out of the house and restricted my daily access to the bookkeeping software, no one would ever look closely at the routing histories or the internal transfer logs. The forensic accountants discovered that Richard was not merely stealing our personal life savings. He was actively committing massive federal wire fraud on a daily basis. He had been systematically siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars directly out of his own clients' private escrow accounts. In the real estate industry, the escrow account is absolutely sacred. It is the highly protected holding tank where innocent buyers place their earnest money and life savings while waiting to close on their dream homes. Richard had quietly and maliciously diverted those protected funds into dummy corporate accounts, disguising the massive withdrawals as pending contractor fees and phantom property inspections. It made me absolutely sick to my stomach to see the names of young couples and retired families on those ledgers. He was gambling with other people's futures just to maintain his own pathetic illusion of incredible wealth. Every single time a client deposited $50,000 for a luxury home purchase, Richard would immediately siphon off a percentage to buy a designer handbag for his young mistress or fund their lavish weekend getaways. The beautiful diamond tennis necklace Brittany wore so proudly during our mediation session was not purchased with Richard's hard-earned real estate commission. It was bought with stolen money belonging to a young couple trying to close on their very first house. I felt a massive wave of profound disgust wash over my entire body. For 7 years, I had worked grueling 80-hour weeks to build a legitimate, respectable business. I had meticulously balanced every single penny to ensure we operated with absolute integrity and honesty. Richard had taken my pristine financial structure and completely corrupted it into a personal piggy bank for his infidelity and his unhinged ego. Victoria watched my face very closely as the horrific reality of his crimes truly sank in. She placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder and calmly told me that this level of financial depravity was exactly what we needed to completely bury him. She explained that a local family court judge might divide assets unfairly in a messy divorce, but federal investigators would absolutely obliterate a broker who stole client escrow funds. Richard had willingly handed us the ultimate weapon of his own destruction. We just needed the undeniable solid proof of his specific intentions regarding the forged home equity loan to ensure he could never possibly blame the missing money on a simple accounting error or a rogue employee. That undeniable ironclad proof arrived late Thursday evening. Victoria is not just a high-profile litigator, she's a fiercely intelligent woman with an incredibly vast network of powerful international connections. Through a series of highly complex legal subpoenas and by aggressively leveraging her corporate contacts in the banking sector, she managed to legally obtain a recorded phone conversation from the offshore financial institution in the Cayman Islands. Because Richard's transactions triggered international anti-money laundering protocols, the bank had routinely recorded his authorization calls for compliance purposes. We sat in the quiet, dimly lit office as Victoria pressed the play button on the secure audio file. The room immediately filled with the unmistakable, confident voice of my husband. He was speaking directly to a private wealth manager, detailing the final meticulous steps of his grand exit strategy. Listening to the recording felt like stepping into a freezing shower. Richard explicitly instructed the offshore banker to finalize the title transfer of the Miami property exclusively into Brittany's name. The banker politely inquired about the sudden influx of the $400,000, warning Richard about domestic tax implications, and inquiring about the source of the funds to satisfy their internal compliance checks. Richard laughed that same arrogant, callous laugh I had heard in our kitchen when he locked me out. He proudly boasted to the banker that there would be absolutely no tax implications for him whatsoever. He confessed with crystal clear audio quality that he had personally forged his wife's digital signature to secure a massive home equity line of credit against their marital home in Chicago. He laid out his entire malicious plan completely unprompted, speaking with the disgusting pride of a man who truly believed he was untouchable. He detailed exactly how he was going to stall the local divorce proceedings just long enough to drain the remaining local accounts dry. He clearly stated that once the fraudulent debt became totally unmanageable for me, he would simply file for personal and corporate bankruptcy. He fully intended to wipe out his legal obligation to the fraudulent debt, completely destroying my credit and leaving me homeless on the streets of Chicago while he lived untouched in a sunny tropical paradise with a woman 10 years younger than me. I listened to the recording play a second time. Every single word he spoke was a deliberate, calculated dagger aimed directly at my back. There was absolutely no lingering trace of the man I thought I had married 7 years ago. The voice on that tape belonged to a remorseless, terrifying predator who viewed my entire existence as nothing more than a disposable stepping stone. Victoria paused the recording and looked at me with a fierce, victorious light shining in her dark eyes. The smoking gun had been successfully captured and secured. The audio file combined seamlessly with the exhaustive forensic audit of the stolen escrow accounts created an impenetrable steel cage of federal evidence. Richard was completely dead in the water. The final piece of our strategy required absolute flawless execution. Victoria could not simply walk into a Chicago courtroom acting as a New York attorney without proper legal authorization. She spent the entire day on Friday preparing a highly specialized legal document known as a motion to appear pro hac vice. This specific legal maneuver allows an out-of-state attorney to officially practice law in a different jurisdiction for one singular specific case. It is a completely standard procedure, but Victoria handled it with the utmost secrecy. She quietly filed the motion directly with the local county clerk, utilizing a heavily expedited private corporate courier service to completely avoid any detection by Richard's sleazy local lawyer. She made absolutely sure that the paperwork was sealed and processed directly by the presiding judge's private chambers, guaranteeing that Richard and his legal bulldog would receive absolutely zero advanced warning of her involvement in the case. The trap was now fully armed, heavily loaded, and completely hidden from view. I spent the entire weekend resting in my cheap motel room, finally allowing my exhausted body to recover and mentally preparing myself for the massive upcoming collision. Richard was spending his weekend celebrating his perceived victory with Brittany, completely unaware that a legal extinction-level event was rapidly heading toward his entire existence. The deeply arrogant man who thought he could steal my money, lock me out of my own life, and leave me to drown in his fraudulent debt was about to experience the absolute worst day of his miserable life. He thought I was just a naive, unpaid bookkeeper who could not afford to fight back. He was about to find himself permanently locked inside a federal prison cell, courtesy of the very woman he thought he had destroyed. The heavy brass handles of the Cook County courthouse doors felt freezing against my damp palms as I pushed my way into the sprawling, echoing lobby. The air inside the judicial building was thick and stagnant, carrying the distinct metallic scent of old floor wax, nervous sweat, and cheap coffee. It was the smell of broken promises and shattered lives. I kept my head bowed deliberately, letting my posture sag as I shuffled through the metal detectors. I wore the exact same faded, oversized gray cardigan I had worn to our disastrous mediation session a week prior. My hair was tied back in a haphazard knot, and I had deliberately foregone sleep the night before to ensure the dark, bruised circles under my eyes were absolutely genuine. I looked like a woman who had spent the last 7 days crying on the stained carpet of a budget motel room, entirely consumed by panic and financial ruin. Every single step I took across the polished marble floor was a highly calculated performance. Inside my chest, a fierce, burning inferno of anticipation was raging, but on the outside, I was the perfect picture of a thoroughly defeated housewife. Richard needed to see a broken woman. He needed to believe that his grand architectural masterpiece of fraud and betrayal had worked flawlessly. I rode the crowded elevator up to the family court division, keeping my gaze fixed firmly on the scuffed tips of my sensible flat shoes. When I finally reached the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B, I took one last deep, shuddering breath to steady my nerves. I pushed the door open and stepped into the gallery. The courtroom was a vast, intimidating space lined with dark wood paneling and rows of rigid wooden benches. The harsh morning sunlight sliced through the tall, narrow windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the center aisle. I spotted them immediately. They were sitting at the petitioner's table, completely relaxed and openly laughing, as if they were waiting for a comedy show to begin, rather than a legal proceeding that would determine the rest of my life. Richard looked like he had just stepped off the cover of a luxury financial magazine. He wore a breathtaking, bespoke navy suit with a subtle pinstripe, a crisp French cuff shirt, and a silk tie that perfectly matched the pocket square folded into his chest pocket. He was leaning casually back in his heavy wooden chair, whispering something incredibly amusing to his attorney. Bradley, his sleazy, aggressive local litigator, was grinning broadly, revealing a row of unnaturally white veneers. Bradley had his thick forearms rested lazily on the polished defense table, exuding the greasy, overconfident aura of a man who firmly believed he was about to slaughter an unarmed opponent. He had a thin manila folder resting in front of him, likely containing the exact same predatory settlement agreement they had tried to force down my throat a week ago. They were entirely convinced that I was going to walk up to that table, break down in hysterical tears, and beg them to let me sign the papers, just to make the terrifying nightmare of the $400,000 home equity loan go away. And sitting directly in the front row of the gallery, directly behind Richard, was Brittany. She had completely disregarded the unspoken rules of courtroom decorum. She was wearing a tight sleeveless designer dress in a vibrant shade of emerald green with oversized dark sunglasses pushed up onto her perfectly styled blonde hair. She was casually scrolling through her smartphone, completely bored by the environment, occasionally looking up to shoot me a look of profound pity and absolute disgust. She was there to claim her trophy. She wanted a front row seat to watch the boring, obsolete wife get legally discarded into the gutter. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my cheap, sensible shoes making absolutely no sound on the carpeted floor. I kept my shoulders hunched and my eyes wide with manufactured terror. I approached the respondents' table, which sat completely empty and barren. I did not have a leather briefcase. I did not have a thick stack of impressive legal files. I had nothing but my small, worn-out purse. I pulled out the flimsy plastic chair and sat down, making sure my hands trembled visibly as I placed them on the cool wooden surface of the table. Richard noticed me sitting down. He stopped laughing with Bradley and turned his chair slightly to face me. The absolute supreme arrogance radiating from his perfectly groomed face was almost suffocating. He leaned across the small gap separating our two tables, invading my physical space with his overwhelming confidence. He did not see a partner he had spent 7 years building a life with. He saw a pathetic, annoying obstacle that was finally ready to be swept away. He lowered his voice to a dark, menacing whisper, ensuring that only I could hear the venom dripping from his words. He told me that I looked absolutely terrible. He chuckled softly and asked if I had enjoyed my extra week in the cheap motel. He leaned in, even closer, the scent of his expensive sandalwood cologne washing over me. He whispered that I should not bother putting up a fight today because the judge was going to ruin me. He told me to just sign the papers and take the $10,000 before he decided to take that away too. Then he delivered the exact line I had been waiting to hear. He smiled a slow, cruel smile and told me that I could not afford anyone good to protect me. I looked down at my shaking hands, biting the inside of my cheek to prevent myself from smiling. He was completely drunk on his own perceived invincibility. He had absolutely no idea that his entire fraudulent empire was currently resting on a digital hard drive back in a highly secure financial district office. He had no idea that we had the audio recording from the Cayman Islands Bank. He had no idea that the noose was already securely wrapped around his neck, and the trapdoor was about to swing wide open. The heavy wooden door at the very back of the courtroom suddenly swung open. The sound was sharp and incredibly authoritative, cutting completely through the low murmur of the gathered lawyers and clerks. The rhythmic, powerful clicking of high heels echoed against the marble floor of the gallery. It was not a hesitant shuffle or a casual stroll. It was the aggressive, measured march of an apex predator stepping directly onto the battlefield. Every single head in the courtroom instinctively turned toward the sound. Even the court clerk stopped typing on her computer to look up. Victoria walked down the center aisle, and the entire atmospheric pressure of the room instantly shifted to accommodate her massive presence. She looked absolutely terrifying. She was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit with a razor-sharp cut that practically screamed corporate warfare. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, immaculate twist at the nape of her neck, completely devoid of a single flyaway strand. She wore no flashy jewelry, no excessive makeup, just an aura of pure, unadulterated power. In her right hand, she carried a structured black leather briefcase that was worth significantly more than the leased sedan Richard was trying to force me to keep. She completely ignored the gallery. She did not even glance at Brittany sitting in her inappropriate green dress. Victoria walked with absolute singular purpose, straight toward the heavy wooden gate that separated the gallery from the legal tables. She pushed the gate open without breaking her stride and walked directly to my side of the room. Richard frowned, his perfectly groomed brow furrowing in deep confusion. He had absolutely no idea who this formidable woman was. He only knew that she did not belong in this basic local family court. Bradley, the greasy local bulldog, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The lazy, relaxed posture completely vanished from his frame. He sat up straight, his predatory instincts suddenly recognizing a much larger, much more dangerous creature entering his territory. Victoria did not look at them. She placed her expensive briefcase gracefully onto the wooden table right next to my Warno purse. The stark contrast between the two objects was poetic. She unclasped the heavy brass locks with a sharp metallic snap that echoed loudly in the quiet room. She reached inside and pulled out a thick, perfectly bound stack of pristine legal documents. The bailiff cleared his throat and loudly announced the arrival of the Honorable Presiding Judge. We all stood as the judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair, took her seat behind the elevated mahogany bench. The judge adjusted her reading glasses and picked up the morning docket sheet. She called the case name loudly echoing through the large room. She announced the matter of the dissolution of marriage and the division of assets. She looked down at Richard and his attorney, and then she looked over at me. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she took in Victoria's imposing figure, standing tall and rigid, right beside my chair. The judge asked for the parties to state their appearances for the official court record. Bradley immediately puffed out his chest, standing up and loudly declaring his representation for the petitioner. He used his most aggressive, booming courtroom voice, clearly trying to assert his dominance early in the proceeding. Victoria did not rush. She allowed a full 3 seconds of heavy, absolute silence to stretch across the room before she finally moved. She buttoned the center button of her tailored blazer, picked up her stack of documents, and walked with slow, terrifying grace directly to the center podium facing the judge. She spoke, and her voice was a flawless instrument of corporate destruction. It was perfectly modulated, crisp, and ringing with undeniable, absolute authority. She formally introduced herself to the court, stating her full legal name and her primary place of business in Manhattan. She politely requested the court's permission to submit her previously filed motion to appear pro hac vice, as the lead counsel representing the respondent in this matter. Bradley practically choked on his own breath. He sprang up from his heavy wooden chair, his face flushing a deep, angry shade of red. He loudly objected, throwing his hands up in the air. He stammered that this was highly irregular. He told the judge that opposing counsel had absolutely no prior notification of outside representation. He pointed a thick, stubby finger at Victoria and dismissively told the judge that my client was supposedly searching for a free public defender to handle a simple, uncontested settlement agreement. He sneered and aggressively stated that they did not have time to entertain some unknown public defender trying to delay the proceedings. Victoria did not even flinch. She did not turn to face Bradley. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood at the podium, radiating a cold, terrifying calm. She waited for his pathetic, sputtering outburst to completely run its course before she finally addressed the bench. She handed the perfectly bound stack of documents up to the court clerk, who passed them to the judge. Victoria calmly informed the court that the proper motions had been securely filed and fully approved by Chambers late Friday afternoon. She politely clarified for the opposing counsel that she was certainly not a public defender. She stated her full title clearly and precisely for the audio record. She announced that she was the senior managing partner of Sterling & Vance, a leading corporate litigation firm headquartered in New York City, specializing in high net worth asset recovery and complex white-collar financial fraud. The absolute devastating silence that fell over the courtroom was heavy enough to crush a diamond. Bradley slowly sank back into his chair, all the blood rapidly draining from his face. The aggressive, smug confidence evaporated from his body like smoke. He was a local bully who fought over basic alimony checks and minor property disputes. He knew exactly what a senior managing partner from a top-tier New York corporate firm represented. It represented a level of legal warfare he was entirely, completely unequipped to handle. Richard sat entirely frozen in his chair. The color completely vanished from his normally tanned face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly terribly sick. His mind was violently racing, frantically trying to connect the impossible dots. He stared at Victoria, taking in her sharp features, her dark hair, and her utterly ruthless demeanor. I could see the exact terrifying second the realization finally hit him. I saw his eyes widen in absolute pure horror as he recognized the striking family resemblance. He finally realized that the heartless corporate shark he used to openly mock behind her back, the estranged older sister he thought I would never have the courage to call, was standing right in front of him. Victoria finally turned away from the judge. She looked directly at Richard and Bradley, her expression utterly devoid of any human warmth. She looked at them the exact same way a scientist examines a particularly disgusting insect under a microscope. Then she turned her gaze to me, still sitting in my cheap faded cardigan, playing the role of the terrified, helpless wife. The hard, severe lines of her face softened just enough to deliver the final lethal blow to Richard's massive, shattered ego. She offered me a cold, brilliant, terrifyingly beautiful smile. Her voice carried clearly across the silent, shocked courtroom, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. She looked right into my eyes and said the words that officially ended my husband's entire life. She told me not to worry about a single thing. She called me sister and calmly promised me that she had this entirely under control. The power dynamic in the room did not just shift completely and violently exploded. Richard slumped back in his chair, staring at us with wide, terrified eyes. He had meticulously built a flawless prison to keep me locked away with his fraudulent debt. He thought he had successfully isolated me from the entire legal world. He had no idea that by pushing me to the absolute edge of total annihilation, he had forced me to summon a monster that was about to financially slaughter him. The simple, easy divorce was officially dead, and the corporate bloodbath had officially begun. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom seemed to hold the absolute silence that had just fallen over the massive room. The air grew instantly thick and stagnant. My sister Victoria stood at the center podium, radiating an aura of total surgical precision. She did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. She simply waited for the presiding judge to finish reviewing her impressive credentials. The judge, a stern, silver-haired woman who had undoubtedly seen thousands of messy divorces, slowly lowered her reading glasses. She looked from the thick premium parchment of Victoria's documents to the suddenly pale, sweating face of my husband. The judge formally recognized Victoria as my lead counsel and instructed her to proceed with her opening remarks regarding the proposed settlement agreement. Victoria did not walk back to our table. She remained anchored at the podium, opening her expensive leather briefcase with a sharp, definitive click. She addressed the court with a voice that was perfectly modulated, carrying a chilling corporate authority that bounced off the high-paneled walls. She politely informed the judge that we were not there to negotiate the pathetic $10,000 settlement Richard had offered. She stated clearly for the official record that we were completely rejecting the petitioner's terms, because the petitioner was actively attempting to use the family court system to facilitate a massive cover-up of multiple federal crimes. A collective gasp echoed from the small gallery behind us. Bradley, the sleazy local attorney who was representing Richard, jumped out of his chair. He slammed his hands on the table and loudly objected, calling the accusation a ridiculous theatrical stunt. He demanded that Victoria be reprimanded for making baseless, slanderous statements in a civil family court matter. Victoria did not even turn her head to acknowledge his outburst. She simply waited for the judge to silence him. The judge banged her gavel hard, demanding order, and instructed Victoria to back up her extraordinary claims with immediate physical proof. This was the exact moment the legal slaughter truly began. Victoria pulled a thick, beautifully bound red folder from her briefcase. She asked the court clerk to approach and hand copies of the initial exhibit to the judge and to opposing counsel. I watched Bradley snatch the folder from the clerk. He flipped it open with an arrogant scoff, but within seconds, the smugness completely vanished from his face. His jaw went slack, and his eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Victoria began to systematically dismantle Richard's entire, carefully constructed financial facade. She spoke with the calm, detached rhythm of a seasoned auditor presenting a final terminal report. She informed the court that my husband was not a successful, wealthy real estate broker. She stated that he was a highly leveraged, deeply indebted fraud who had been running a localized Ponzi scheme through his luxury brokerage. She directed the judge to look at page 3 of the red folder. With absolute ruthless clarity, Victoria detailed how Richard had been illegally siphoning massive amounts of money directly out of his clients' private escrow accounts. She explained the sacred nature of earnest money deposits and how Richard had deliberately diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars from innocent young families trying to buy homes. She presented undeniable digital routing logs, showing those exact protected funds being quietly transferred into dummy corporate holding accounts. She then showed the corresponding bank statements proving that those exact stolen funds were immediately used to purchase luxury vehicles, expensive tailored suits, and the incredibly flashy diamond tennis necklace currently resting on the collarbone of his mistress Brittany, who was sitting right there in the front row of the gallery. The judge looked up from the documents, her expression hardening into a mask of pure judicial fury. She stared directly at Richard. Richard was physically shrinking into his heavy wooden chair. His custom-tailored navy suit suddenly looked far too large for his deflating frame. He tried to lean over and whisper to Bradley, but his attorney physically recoiled, sliding his chair a few inches away. Bradley was staring at the undeniable forensic accounting trail, realizing he had been completely blinded by his client's charming lies. But Victoria was not even remotely finished. She had only just cracked the surface of his deception. She reached back into her briefcase and pulled out a second folder, this one bound in stark black. She handed the copies to the clerk and instructed the court to review the documents regarding the $400,000 home equity line of credit. Victoria turned slightly so she could look directly at Richard as she delivered the next devastating blow. She explained to the judge that Richard had presented this massive debt as a joint marital liability and demanded that I assume full responsibility for it in his predatory settlement offer. She stated that Richard had repeatedly claimed I willingly signed the approval forms. Then Victoria lowered her voice, making the quiet courtroom strain to hear her. She declared that the signature was a complete and total forgery. Bradley immediately stood up again, though his legs looked noticeably unsteady. He objected, stating that they possessed a digitally certified document bearing my exact electronic signature and timestamp. He weakly argued that buyer's remorse did not constitute legal fraud. Victoria offered a cold, terrifying smile. She did not argue with him. She simply directed the judge to page 7 of the black folder. She explained that her team of elite forensic data specialists in New York had not just looked at the digital signature itself. They had successfully subpoenaed the underlying metadata and the precise Internet Protocol address attached to the exact moment the signature was rendered. Victoria read the findings aloud with brutal, unyielding precision. The document was not signed from my home laptop or my cellular phone. The digital metadata proved undeniably that the forged signature was executed from a highly secure private internet network. It was the exact dedicated network installed exclusively inside Richard's downtown real estate office. Furthermore, the timestamp on the forgery perfectly matched a window of time when I was physically out of the state, visiting our sick aunt in Ohio, an alibi backed by airline boarding passes and hotel receipts included in the very next exhibit. The absolute silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The only sound was the heavy ticking of the wall clock and the rapid, panicked breathing coming from Richard's side of the table. He was sweating profusely now. Small beads of moisture were gathering on his forehead, and his perfectly styled hair was beginning to look desperate and unkempt. He was staring at Victoria as if she were the Grim Reaper herself holding the scythe that was about to sever his head. Victoria paused, allowing the massive weight of the federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft charges to completely settle over the defense table. She wanted Richard to feel the exact same paralyzing financial terror he had so eagerly inflicted upon me when he locked me out of my own home. She waited until the judge finished reading the metadata report before moving in for the absolute final kill. She announced that she had one final exhibit to submit to the court. She pulled out a thin blue folder containing a certified official transcript. She explained that because Richard had moved the stolen money across international borders to purchase a beachfront condominium in the Cayman Islands, he had unknowingly triggered strict global anti-money laundering protocols. Victoria stated that she had legally utilized her international corporate banking connections to subpoena the official recorded compliance phone call between Richard and his private offshore wealth manager. Bradley completely stopped moving. He froze, staring at the blue folder the clerk dropped onto his table, as if it were a live grenade completely ready to detonate. Victoria did not ask to play the audio in the courtroom. Instead, she stood tall at the podium and read the certified sworn transcript aloud, ensuring every single malicious word Richard had spoken was permanently etched into the official court record. She read his arrogant laughter. She read his explicit direct confession to the offshore banker, detailing exactly how he had personally forged my signature on the bank documents to secure the fraudulent loan. She read his chilling boast about how he planned to delay the local divorce proceedings just long enough to financially starve me out. And finally, she read his ultimate deeply illegal strategy. She read his detailed intention to officially file for personal and corporate bankruptcy immediately after the divorce was finalized, specifically to wipe out his legal obligation to the stolen bank funds, leaving me to absorb the total, massive destruction of the debt. When Victoria finished reading the transcript, she closed the blue folder and placed it gently onto the podium. She looked up at the judge and stated that this was not a simple family court dispute over the division of a Honda sedan. She declared that Richard had committed gross perjury, federal wire fraud, embezzlement of client funds, and aggravated identity theft. She formally requested that the judge immediately freeze every single one of Richard's domestic and international assets, dissolve his real estate brokerage pending a full federal investigation, and forward the entire court record directly to the United States District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal prosecution. The courtroom completely erupted into chaos. The gallery behind us started murmuring loudly. Brittany, who had been sitting in the front row, radiating smug entitlement, let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She dropped her smartphone onto the wooden floor, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She stared at the back of Richard's head, her eyes wide with sudden absolute panic. The beautiful diamond necklace around her neck suddenly felt like a heavy, very traceable piece of criminal evidence. But the most spectacular reaction did not come from my husband or his mistress. It came from his attorney. Bradley, the aggressive, sleazy local litigator who had built a career on bullying terrified housewives, suddenly realized the incredibly perilous position he was currently sitting in. He was a sworn officer of the court, and he had just unknowingly presented a completely fraudulent settlement document to a sitting judge while actively representing a client who was confessing to federal felonies on an offshore wiretap. If Bradley continued to defend Richard, he risked becoming a formal accessory to the ongoing fraud. He risked losing his law license, his livelihood, and his own freedom. The absolute terror of self-preservation completely overrode any loyalty he had to his wealthy client. Bradley stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair violently tipped over, crashing loudly onto the floor behind him. He did not bother to pick it up. He frantically gathered his papers, shoving them indiscriminately into his leather briefcase. He raised his hands in a universal gesture of surrender. He loudly addressed the judge, his voice shaking with genuine panic. He stated for the immediate official record that he had absolutely zero prior knowledge of any forged documents, undisclosed offshore assets, or stolen client escrow funds. He declared that his client had willfully and maliciously lied to him and used his legal services to perpetrate a fraud upon the court. Bradley formally, immediately, and aggressively moved to withdraw, as Richard's legal counsel citing a total, irreconcilable breakdown of the attorney-client privilege and ongoing criminal exposure. The judge looked at the panicked lawyer and simply nodded, granting the motion to withdraw without a single moment of hesitation. Bradley did not even look at Richard. He zipped his briefcase, grabbed his coat, and practically ran down the center aisle of the courtroom, completely abandoning my husband to the absolute mercy of the legal slaughterhouse. Richard was left entirely alone, sitting at a large wooden table that suddenly looked incredibly empty. The smug, invincible armor he had worn his entire life was completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. He looked wildly around the room, breathing in short, ragged gasps. He looked at the judge, whose face was a mask of cold judicial fury. He looked at Victoria, who was standing tall and completely unbothered at the podium, watching him drown. And finally, he looked at me. There were no more taunting whispers. There was no more arrogant laughter. He looked at me with the wide, completely terrified eyes of a man who suddenly realizes he has absolutely no way out. The realization of his total immediate destruction finally crashed down upon him. In a last desperate, pathetic attempt to save his own skin, the great wealthy real estate mogul completely abandoned every shred of his so-called loyalty. He turned around in his chair, pointing a shaking, desperate finger directly at the front row of the gallery. He pointed straight at Brittany. He started frantically babbling to the judge, his voice pitching up into a hysterical whine. He claimed that it was not his fault. He shrieked that Brittany had manipulated him. He lied loudly, stating that she was the one who desperately wanted the Miami condominium and that she was the one who had actually forged my signature on the computer in the office while he was away. He offered up the young woman he had destroyed my entire life for trying to throw her directly under the massive approaching bus to save himself. Brittany stood up from the wooden bench, her face draining of all color. The ultimate betrayal completely washed over her as she realized the man who had promised her a life of endless luxury was actively trying to send her to federal prison. She let out a loud sobbing wail, screaming that he was a liar and a monster before pushing past the heavy wooden doors and running out of the courtroom, leaving him completely, utterly, and entirely alone. Victoria calmly gathered her documents, returning them to her expensive leather briefcase. The trap had been flawlessly executed. The predator had become the prey. The long, deeply satisfying legal slaughter was completely over, and Richard was entirely buried beneath the rubble of his own magnificent greed. The heavy silence in the courtroom following Victoria's devastating presentation was absolute and suffocating. It was a thick, tangible quiet that pressed heavily against the dark wood paneling and the rigid spectator benches. The presiding judge, a woman whose silver hair and sharp eyes commanded total uncompromising respect, stared down at the scattered forensic documents and the blue folder containing the offshore audio transcript resting on her elevated mahogany bench. She did not simply review the presented evidence. She absorbed the sheer, astonishing magnitude of the financial depravity my husband had meticulously orchestrated. When she finally looked up from the Cayman Islands banking records, her expression had transformed into a mask of cold, unyielding, judicial fury. She did not mince her words, and she did not offer Richard a single solitary opportunity to explain his federal crimes. Her voice cracked through the still, stale air of the courtroom like a physical whip. She formally declared for the official record that based on the undeniable forensic metadata surrounding the forged signature and the explicitly recorded offshore confession, she was immediately granting every single one of Victoria's emergency motions. She struck her heavy wooden gavel with a deafening crack that echoed violently off the high ceiling, signaling the absolute end of Richard's untouchable empire. With a swift, aggressive stroke of her pen, the judge issued an immediate emergency injunction. She ordered the absolute freezing of every single domestic bank account bearing Richard's name or his corporate identifiers. She mandated the immediate suspension of his luxury real estate brokerage pending a comprehensive federal audit of the stolen client escrow funds. But her ruling did not stop at the city limits. The judge explicitly targeted the international wire transfers, tracking the stolen money directly to its destination. She ordered the immediate freezing of the Cayman Islands shell accounts, including the specific offshore trust, currently holding the stolen $400,000 registered exclusively under Brittany's name. She firmly announced that the entire civil court record, including the damning audio confession, was being immediately transferred to the United States District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution regarding severe wire fraud and grand larceny. I sat perfectly still in my cheap faded cardigan, watching my husband's entire universe collapse into ash right in front of my eyes. Richard was physically shrinking into his heavy wooden chair. The bespoke, custom-tailored navy suit that had radiated such supreme arrogance just 20 minutes ago now looked like a borrowed, oversized costume hanging loosely over a terrified, hollow man. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving irregularly as his panicked eyes darted around the large room, desperately searching for a legal loophole that simply did not exist. The man who had meticulously plotted to bury me in $500,000 of forged debt was now legally stripped of every single penny he had ever stolen. The bailiff officially dismissed the court, instructing all gathered parties to clear the room immediately. I stood up slowly, picking up my worn-out purse from the chipped laminate table. Victoria calmly snapped the heavy brass locks of her leather briefcase shut, radiating the serene, chilling satisfaction of an apex predator who had just successfully completed a flawless hunt. We walked together down the center aisle, our footsteps falling in perfect synchronized rhythm against the carpet. We pushed through the heavy double oak doors and stepped out into the bright, glaring fluorescent light of the courthouse hallway. The long corridor was lined with polished marble and harsh overhead fixtures, illuminating the ugly reality of the people standing within it. Richard stumbled out of the courtroom a few paces behind us, looking completely disoriented and thoroughly destroyed. He was sweating profusely, wiping his trembling hand across his pale forehead, while muttering unintelligible, desperate curses under his breath. He had been completely abandoned by his sleazy local attorney, who had sprinted out of the building to save his own law license, and Richard was now entirely untethered from his stolen wealth and his protective local connections. Brittany pushed aggressively past him, practically sprinting out into the hallway. The vibrant emerald green designer dress she had worn like a smug victory banner now looked completely absurd in the harsh light of the criminal justice system. She was gripping her expensive smartphone with both hands, her long manicured fingers frantically tapping against the glass screen. She leaned heavily against the cold marble wall, her eyes completely, entirely locked on her mobile banking application. I stopped walking and stood quietly beside my sister, watching Brittany's face undergo a spectacular, violent transformation. The smug, untouchable entitlement she had paraded into the mediation session vanished in a fraction of a second. It was instantly replaced by raw, visceral terror. She was desperately trying to log into the private offshore Cayman Islands banking portal. She refreshed the application over and over again. She typed in her secure credentials with shaking thumbs. Her perfectly contoured face drained of all natural color, leaving her looking sickly gray and remarkably hollow. The digital screen brightly displayed a glaring bold error message, indicating that her international accounts were locked frozen and entirely inaccessible by order of a federal mandate. The $400,000 she firmly believed she had safely secured for her new luxurious beachfront life was completely gone. She was staring at a zero balance. The reality of the judge's emergency injunction crashed down upon her shoulders with devastating force. She suddenly realized that the older, wealthy real estate mogul she had traded her morals for was no longer a golden goose producing endless streams of stolen cash. He was an incredibly dangerous sinking ship, wrapped tightly in a massive federal indictment, and she was currently sitting right in the passenger seat, directly in the crosshairs of the United States government. Brittany slowly lifted her head from the glowing screen. She looked at Richard, who was currently leaning heavily against a wooden bench, trying to catch his breath and loosen his silk tie. The profound pity and romantic devotion she had previously displayed for him evaporated completely into the stale courthouse air. It was replaced by the purest, most ruthless form of selfish survival instinct. She did not gently walk over to him to ask what had happened or offer a comforting embrace. She completely and totally erupted. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed violently down the long marble corridor, forcing several passing clerks and bewildered attorneys to stop dead in their tracks. She marched directly up to Richard, her face twisted in absolute fury and pure unrestrained panic. She raised her arm and violently hurled her heavy designer leather purse directly at his chest. The heavy brass hardware on the expensive bag struck him hard, causing him to stagger backward in physical shock as the contents spilled across the polished floor. She screamed at the very top of her lungs, asking him what he had done to her money and her future. Richard weakly raised his trembling hands, begging her to lower her voice, frantically shushing her in the public corridor, aware that every single person was watching his humiliating downfall. He stammered pathetically, promising her that he could fix the financial situation if she just gave him a little time to call a different defense lawyer. He begged her to remain calm and trust him. Brittany let out a loud, bitter laugh that sounded completely unhinged and entirely devoid of any warmth. She realized with terrifying crystal clarity that there was absolutely no fixing federal wire fraud, and there was certainly no fixing missing escrow funds. She spun around wildly, her panicked eyes locking onto Victoria, who was standing quietly beside me, observing the spectacular implosion with a cold, clinical amusement. Brittany pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly at Richard's chest. but she projected her hysterical voice entirely toward my sister and the armed court bailiff who had stepped out into the hallway to investigate the loud commotion. She desperately, loudly, and explicitly began to throw my husband completely under the massive approaching legal bus in a frantic attempt to save her own skin from federal prison. She shrieked that she had absolutely nothing to do with the stolen client escrow funds. She hysterically declared to the entire hallway that Richard was a manipulative, pathological liar who had forced her to open the offshore accounts under duress. She swore loudly to the listening bailiff that she had never wanted the Miami condominium and that Richard had physically intimidated her into accepting the fraudulent international wire transfers. She played the ultimate terrified victim, completely denying any prior knowledge of the forged home equity loan, desperately trying to distance herself from the radioactive blast radius of his massive financial crimes. She yelled that Richard had masterminded the entire embezzlement scheme alone, and that she was just a naive junior employee who followed her boss's corrupt orders. She was enthusiastically supplying the authorities with verbal confirmation of his guilt right there in the open corridor. She begged Victoria to tell the federal prosecutors that she was entirely innocent and willing to testify against Richard in exchange for full legal immunity. Richard stared at her with wide, terrified eyes, watching the young, flashy woman he had destroyed my entire life for willingly handing the federal authorities the absolute final nail for his coffin. The betrayal cut him incredibly deep. He tried to reach out to her to grab her arm and silence her frantic confessions, but she slapped his hand away with absolute visceral revulsion, screaming at him to never touch her again. She called him a broke, pathetic criminal and kicked his fallen briefcase before running blindly down the hallway toward the exit, leaving him completely, utterly, and entirely alone, surrounded by staring strangers. I stood quietly beside my brilliant sister, watching the two deeply arrogant people, who had so confidently plotted my destruction, tear each other into tiny, miserable pieces. The deep, suffocating despair that had chained me to that cheap motel bed for the past week was completely gone. I felt an incredible, soaring sense of absolute vindication. The legal slaughter was magnificent, and the terrifying monsters who had tried to bury me were currently digging their own shallow graves right there on the cold marble floor. I adjusted my faded gray cardigan and smiled a small, genuine smile for the first time in months. The nightmare was finally over, and the long, beautiful process of rebuilding my life had officially begun. The speed at which a massive empire of lies completely collapses is truly a magnificent thing to witness. For 7 long years, I had watched Richard build his glittering reputation in the Chicago luxury real estate market, brick by fraudulent brick. I had meticulously balanced the corporate books and managed the daily schedules, completely blind to the dark rot festering beneath the polished floorboards. But once Victoria brilliantly exposed the stolen escrow accounts in open court, the toxic infection could no longer be contained or hidden. The legal fallout was not just incredibly swift, it was entirely apocalyptic. By the following morning, the State Department of Financial and Professional Regulation convened an emergency disciplinary hearing. They did not even wait for a formal criminal conviction to take action. The overwhelming mountain of undeniable digital evidence provided by Victoria's elite forensic accounting team was more than enough to permanently and irrevocably revoke his broker's license. The heavy glass doors of his prestigious downtown boutique agency were unceremoniously padlocked by state officials. Bright neon orange seizure notices were thickly plastered across the front windows for every passing commuter and rival real estate broker to openly see. But the humiliating loss of his professional license was merely the opening act of his total personal destruction. The absolute worst nightmare for any real estate professional is a blatant violation of client trust. And Richard had committed the ultimate cardinal sin. The shocking news of the frozen escrow accounts spread through the wealthy community like a catastrophic wildfire. Dozens of young families, newlywed couples, and retired clients who had blindly entrusted Richard with their life savings suddenly realized their earnest money was completely gone. The widespread community panic morphed instantly into a terrifying collective rage. Within 48 hours, a large coalition of furious clients banded together to file a massive unified lawsuit against him. They were aggressively demanding full financial restitution, punitive damages, and maximum criminal prosecution. Richard was no longer the charming local celebrity broker who enthusiastically sponsored Little League teams and hosted lavish charity galas. He was suddenly a notorious pariah, a financial predator whose face was plastered across the evening television news broadcasts and digital media outlets. He had spent a lifetime desperately craving public attention, and now he finally had it for all the wrong reasons. With all of his personal savings and business accounts entirely frozen by the judge's emergency legal injunction, Richard had absolutely nowhere left to hide. The luxury world he had so confidently stolen to finance was completely walled off from him. He could not access a single dime to hire a new high-powered defense attorney, and he certainly could not afford to stay in a premium downtown hotel. He was painfully forced to retreat to a cheap, bleak, temporary leased apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was a poetic parallel to the dingy, miserable motel room he had tried to banish me to just a few days prior. But unlike my brief stay in exile, his dark isolation was going to be permanent. The final heavy hammer of absolute justice dropped on a bleak Tuesday morning, just as the grey city sky began to lighten. I was sitting safely in Victoria's secure office, sipping a hot cup of herbal tea, when she received the official notification from her contacts at the federal prosecutor's office. A highly coordinated strike team of federal agents from the government bureau, alongside local financial crime detectives, descended upon Richard's depressing apartment complex. They did not bother to politely ring the doorbell. They delivered a series of heavy rhythmic pounds against the cheap wooden door, loudly announcing their physical presence and their active federal warrants. When Richard finally opened the door, the image captured by the local news crews who had been tipped off to the raid was absolutely breathtaking to witness. The man who was roughly led out into the damp morning air was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant titan of industry who had sneered at me in the mediation room was entirely gone. He was heavily unshaven, his face pale and swollen with total exhaustion and sheer visceral terror. He was wearing a pair of wrinkled grey sweatpants and a stained undershirt. His wrists were firmly secured behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. He kept his head bowed, staring at the wet pavement, completely unable to meet the glaring lenses of the news cameras, documenting his magnificent downfall. He was officially charged with multiple serious counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, embezzlement, and severe bank fraud. Richard was not the only one caught in the inescapable federal net that morning. Brittany, the young flashy mistress, who had laughed at my pain and proudly worn stolen diamonds around her neck, quickly discovered that her desperate hallway confession was not nearly enough to save her from the consequences of her own boundless greed. Because her name was officially registered on the offshore shell accounts in the banking registry, and because she had knowingly received and spent stolen escrow funds, federal prosecutors indicted her as a willing accomplice to the financial crimes. She was arrested at her own apartment on the exact same morning. The glamorous, luxurious life she had eagerly traded her morals to achieve dissolved instantly into the harsh, terrifying reality of federal custody and a looming prison sentence. They had truly thought they were the smartest people in the room, completely untouchable in their arrogant little bubble. Now they were just two ordinary criminals facing decades behind cold steel bars. Later that evening, the atmosphere in my new quiet apartment was perfectly still. I was finally breathing freely, unburdened by the crushing weight of the forged $500,000 debt that had been successfully voided by the federal court order. The shrill ring of my cellular phone broke the peaceful silence in my living room. I looked down at the glowing screen and saw an incoming call originating from the county correctional facility. The automated robotic voice of the jail system informed me that I had a collect call from a federal inmate. A week ago, the mere thought of speaking to Richard would have sent me into a blind, terrifying panic. I would have been trembling, terrified of his manipulative words and his cruel psychological games. But sitting there, wrapped in a warm blanket, totally secure in my restored life, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, detached curiosity. I pressed the button on my screen to accept the charges. The line clicked open, and the sound of frantic, ragged breathing filled my ear. Then Richard spoke. His voice was completely shattered, stripped of all the smooth, charming cadence he had used to deceive me and the rest of the world for 7 long years. He was openly, violently sobbing into the receiver. He sounded exactly like a terrified, broken child who had finally been caught stealing. He begged me to listen to him. He choked on his tears, telling me that the jail cell was freezing and that he was absolutely terrified of the men he was locked in with. He pleaded for my forgiveness, repeating over and over again that he had made a terrible, catastrophic mistake. He swore that he never truly meant to hurt me and that the intense financial pressure had simply driven him insane. He practically choked on his own spit as he begged me to call Victoria. He pleaded with me to ask my ruthless sister to drop the civil lawsuits and tell the federal prosecutors that we could settle the matter privately without him going to trial. He promised to give me absolutely anything I wanted if I could just make the terrifying nightmare stop. I sat quietly and let him empty his pathetic soul. I let him cry and beg and grovel until he literally ran out of breath. I thought about the morning he locked me out of my own home with nothing but my purse and the clothes on my back. I thought about the arrogant smirk on his face when he handed me those divorce papers, trying to bury me in his fraudulent debt, while he planned his tropical escape. I thought about the utter lack of human empathy he displayed when he thought I was completely powerless and broken. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or match his hysterical panic. I spoke with a voice that was perfectly calm, cool, and devastatingly final. I told him that he had made his choices with absolute clarity and precision. I reminded him of the exact moment we sat in that kitchen when I begged him to reverse the fraudulent loan, and he had looked me dead in the eye and laughed. I let a few seconds of heavy silence stretch across the line, letting my words sink deep into his terrified mind. Then I delivered the final absolute truth. I told him, "You laughed when you locked me out. I am laughing while they lock you in." Before he could utter another pathetic, sobbing word, I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button disconnecting the call forever. I immediately went into my phone settings and permanently blocked the number. The cord connecting me to his toxic, destructive existence was officially, completely, and permanently severed. The incredible journey from being a discarded, terrified housewife to becoming a woman who stood tall and watched her abuser face ultimate justice changed me on a fundamental molecular level. I had allowed myself to be diminished to play the role of the quiet, supportive background character while a monster built an empire of lies on my back. But when the fire finally came to consume me, I did not burn. I discovered a resilient, unbreakable strength I never knew I possessed. Victoria and I rebuilt our relationship, forging a new powerful bond built on mutual respect and shared victory. My credit was fully restored, my stolen assets were recovered, and I finally had the peaceful, independent life I truly deserved. Richard and his mistress traded their stolen luxury for the cold, harsh reality of federal prison, a fitting and perfect end for two people who believed empathy was a weakness and greed was a virtue. If you have ever found yourself completely pushed to the absolute brink by someone who mistook your kindness for profound weakness, I want you to remember my story. Never let anyone convince you that you are powerless. Never let a manipulative abuser dictate your worth or back you into a dark corner. The truth is an incredibly powerful weapon, and when you finally decide to stand up and fight back, the monsters who try to destroy you will inevitably dig their own graves. Thank you so much for listening to my journey of survival and ultimate justice. If this story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic betrayal, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of strength and redemption. Drop a comment below and let me know the city you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this video. I read every single comment, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and remember that your greatest comeback is always just one brave decision away. The heavy wooden gavel struck the polished mahogany-sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack that reverberated through every single hollow chamber of my chest. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire 32 years of life. The federal judge, a stern, uncompromising woman who tolerated absolutely no deception, sat high above the courtroom and delivered the final absolute ruling on the complete division of our marital assets. Richard was completely absent from this particular civil proceeding, as he was currently sitting in a cold concrete federal holding cell, entirely consumed by his impending criminal trial for massive wire fraud and grand larceny. His absence left a wonderful, pristine vacuum in the courtroom. The terrifying, fraudulent home equity line of credit, the very weapon he had so maliciously forged to completely destroy my future and leave me homeless, was formally and permanently nullified by the court. The judge explicitly ruled that my digital signature had been criminally fabricated legally, severing me from the $500,000 of toxic debt. The banking institution that had blindly approved his reckless offshore transfers was forced to completely absorb the massive financial loss, leaving them to pursue Richard and his incarcerated mistress through the sluggish, unyielding channels of the federal criminal justice system. I was finally completely and undeniably free from his suffocating financial trap. But the profound judicial victory did not stop at simply clearing my name, because Richard had brazenly utilized our protected marital assets to actively fund his illegal escrow skimming operation and his illicit tropical real estate purchases. The judge delivered an incredibly brutal financial penalty. She awarded me 100% total control over every single remaining clean liquid asset tied to his name and his luxury real estate brokerage. However, the true undeniable crown jewel of this legal slaughter was not the cash sitting in the frozen bank accounts. It was the absolute sole ownership of his highly coveted proprietary client list. For 7 grueling years, Richard had treated me like a glorified disposable secretary. He had constantly belittled my meticulous administrative work, referring to my bookkeeping as basic and painfully boring. He had absolutely no idea that by forcing me to quietly manage the back end of his entire operation, he had inadvertently handed me the master keys to his entire glittering kingdom. I knew the private investment portfolios, the intimate family dynamics, and the highly specific purchasing habits of every single high net worth individual in the greater Chicago area. I did not waste a single moment letting that absolute goldmine sit idle. Within 48 hours of the final court order being stamped and certified, I personally reached out to the chief executive officer of Richard's absolute fiercest corporate competitor. They were a massive, aggressive real estate conglomerate that had spent the last decade desperately trying to push my husband out of the lucrative Gold Coast housing market. I walked into their towering glass and steel headquarters holding a single encrypted flash drive, and I offered them the entire undisputed database. The ensuing negotiation was breathtakingly swift and incredibly lucrative. The executives eagerly paid a massive, unprecedented premium for the exclusive permanent rights to those elite contacts, completely eager to swallow up the remnants of Richard's shattered empire. I walked out of that corporate boardroom holding a certified cashier's check that permanently secured my absolute financial independence for the rest of my natural life. The delicious, profound irony of the situation was completely intoxicating. The exact tedious administrative labor Richard had openly mocked and discarded had ultimately become the precise instrument of my immense permanent wealth. That evening, Victoria and I shared a quiet, intensely private dinner to celebrate the absolute finality of our victory. We chose a secluded, dimly lit Italian restaurant tucked away on a quiet cobblestone street, completely insulated from the frantic, chaotic energy of the city outside. The soft, flickering candlelight danced gracefully across the heavy mahogany table, illuminating the profound shift in my older sister's demeanor. The terrifying, severe mask of the ruthless Manhattan corporate litigator had been completely put away for the night. She was no longer the apex predator who had systematically destroyed my husband in a court of law. Sitting across from me, sipping a glass of vintage Barolo wine, she was simply my older sister again. We did not talk about the mechanics of the trial or the pathetic, terrified look on Richard's face when the federal agents had finally arrived at his door. We talked about us. We talked about the 6 long years of stubborn, bitter silence that had kept us separated. The old deep wounds that had festered ever since our father's passing were finally lanced and gently drained in the quiet intimacy of that restaurant. I looked across the table and offered a sincere, tearful apology for failing to understand her rigid, pragmatic approach to our shared grief all those years ago. I admitted that my own naive emotional reactions had completely blinded me to the fact that she was simply trying to protect our family assets the only way she knew how. Victoria reached across the white linen tablecloth and took my hands in hers, her sharp eyes softening with a rare, genuine warmth. She apologized for being too intensely cold when I desperately needed a comforting shoulder to cry on. We both realized in that beautiful healing moment that our late father's legendary stubborn pride had deeply infected us both. But this horrific nightmare with Richard had forcefully burned all of that foolish pride away into ash. We raised our crystal wine glasses and made a silent, unbreakable vow to one another. We swore that no man, no amount of money, and no petty familial misunderstanding would ever be allowed to divide us again. The intense, terrifying ordeal had permanently repaired our fractured sisterhood, explicitly proving that the deep bonds of blood and true loyalty run infinitely deeper than any past argument. When the entire world was actively conspiring to completely destroy me, my sister had dropped everything to become my ultimate shield and my sharpest sword. The gentle, rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves against the pristine white shoreline is the very first sound I hear every single morning now. I stand on the expansive wraparound cedar deck of my newly purchased beachfront property, letting the warm, salty coastal breeze gently wrap around my bare shoulders. The vibrant orange and pink hues of the morning sun slowly illuminate the endless horizon, reflecting off the calm, sparkling water. There are no more freezing, bitter Chicago winters to endure. There are no more toxic, suffocating marriages to carefully navigate. There are no more late nights spent meticulously checking fraudulent bank statements or waiting for an arrogant, dishonest man to return home from his secret life. My current existence is entirely my own, completely peaceful and wonderfully quiet. I take a slow sip of my hot black coffee and allow my mind to briefly wander back to that terrified, helpless woman desperately crying on the edge of a sagging mattress in a cheap, bleach-scented motel room. She felt so incredibly small, so hopelessly trapped, and so entirely, completely alone. She actually believed her entire life was completely over because a narcissistic, calculating predator had aggressively told her it was. She thought she had absolutely no power and no voice. But that frightened, submissive woman had to be completely shattered so that the independent, wealthy woman standing on this beautiful balcony could finally be born. I look down at my own two hands. They are the exact same hands that painstakingly managed those complicated business ledgers for 7 unpaid years. They are the exact same hands that bravely packed a single scuffed suitcase in the dead of night when my entire world violently collapsed. And they are the exact same hands that ultimately confidently signed the binding legal documents transferring my abuser's entire financial empire directly into my own personal bank account. I did not just survive the massive inferno that Richard deliberately set to consume me. I used those very flames to forge a completely new, impenetrable armor. I am speaking directly to you right now, looking straight through this camera, because I know there is someone out there listening who desperately needs to hear this. I want you to take my words and let them embed themselves deep into your soul. Never sacrifice your financial independence for a man's ego. The moment you let someone else control the keys to your life, they can lock you out. Never allow yourself to become entirely dependent on someone who demands your absolute submission in exchange for a false sense of security. You must always actively, fiercely maintain your own quiet strength, your own private resources, and your own unwavering belief in your fundamental worth. Do not ever let a manipulative coward convince you that you are merely a background character in their grand theatrical production. You are the sole, unyielding author of your own incredible destiny, and you possess a dormant power far greater than any toxic person could ever possibly comprehend. If my story reminded you of your own strength, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where my strong sisters and brothers are watching from. Drop your city and time in the comments below. For example, Miami 9 p.m. Stay strong, and I'll see you in the next story.